Ever really stopped and thought about how much this whole nation thing really shapes our world? Like, it
Mm.
just seems so, I don't know, fundamental.
Right. Baked in.
But what if I told you this whole concept is, like, way more recent than we usually realize and way more constructed?
Oh, absolutely. What we think of as ancient traditions, deep-rooted identities, a lot of times you can trace them back to, well, surprisingly recent events.
Wow, really?
Yeah, and often very deliberate choices, decisions made for very specific reasons, often political.
So it's all a bit more fabricated than we might assume.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so where do we even start with all of this?
Well, I think a good starting point is to kind of blow up this idea that nationalism itself is ancient. It's really not. It's very much a product of modernity. It's tied in deeply with, like, the Industrial Revolution, actually.
Huh, okay. See, that's not a connection I would have made. Industrialization, nationalism, how does that?
I know, right? But think about it. You have this massive social upheaval, right? People ripped from their traditional communities, their farms, their extended families, they're all migrating, looking for work in these new urban centers.
So it's like everyone's suddenly adrift.
Totally. And they're surrounded by strangers, all competing in this impersonal factory system. It was a recipe for, well, a sense of loss, really.
And a lack of belonging, it sounds like.
Exactly. And that void, that's where nationalism comes in. It gave them a new kind of community, a shared identity, but not one based on the old ties of village or family.
But on this, what broader idea of the nation.
Ex-
So less about a shared past, more about
A shared future.
well, that and a shared experience in the present, even if that experience is, what's the word? More imagined than real.
You're spot on. There's this scholar of nationalism, Benedict Anderson, and he called it exactly that, the imagined community. He said print media was huge for this.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, you have newspapers, mass-produced books, right?
Yeah.
Suddenly, people who'd never meet in person, they're reading the same things, sharing stories, information, creates this feeling of commonality.
It's wild to think something as simple as a newspaper could, like, forge a sense of kinship across a whole country.
Right, and that feeling, we're all in this together, even if it's with millions of strangers, that's the bedrock of nationalism.
The glue that holds these massive imagined communities together.
Yes, exactly.
But, and I think this is important, it's not always neat, is it? Not every nation maps perfectly onto a single ethnic group, a single culture.
Oh, absolutely not. That's where the classic European model of nationalism, while influential, it doesn't really capture the whole picture.
Right. It's easy to forget that in a lot of places, diversity is the whole point.
100%. Think about somewhere like Mexico. Their whole concept of national identity, it's built on this idea of mestizaje,
Mestizaje.
the blending of indigenous and European cultures. It's not about purity, it's about the mixing.
Wow. That's such a different way of thinking about it. Not we're all descended from the same place, but we've all come together to create something new.
Exactly. And it poses a really interesting question, right? If it's not shared ancestry, what are those ties that bind diverse nations together? What's the glue in those cases?
Yeah, good question. What is it?
That's something a lot of nations are wrestling with right now, I think. It's at the heart of a lot of our debates today about immigration, multiculturalism, what it even means to belong,
It's complex.
to say the least.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it, right?
Yeah.
Nations, these like ideas we've built up, they end up with so much power. We pledge allegiance to flags, we pay taxes.
Right. All because this entity, this nation state, claims to speak for us.
And it's not always pretty, is it? History's full of nation states doing some pretty terrible things, all in the name of, national interest, whatever that means at the time.
Yeah, it's a real paradox, nationalism. Can inspire incredible solidarity one minute, terrifying violence the next.
So how do we even get here? If it's this modern invention, as we're saying, what makes it so potent that people buy into it so strongly?
Part of it, honestly, is how nation states took older power structures and just supersized them.
What do you mean?
Think about the basics any state needs: enforcing laws, taxes, keeping things from descending into chaos. This isn't new stuff.
Okay, but nations do it on a much bigger scale.
Exactly. Industrialization, cities booming, mass communication. Suddenly you can control a level of complexity earlier societies couldn't fathom. Huge armies, centralized taxes, even shaping how people think.
Through education, propaganda, all that?
All of it. It's like
Yeah.
the nation state becomes this total environment, right?
Right.
Language, values, how we understand history itself.
We're all taught a specific version of the past, usually.
And that's key, right? That shared narrative, even if it's massaged a bit, it creates this framework of belonging. Who's in, who's out.
Which brings us to the whole minority problem. Like, it's almost unavoidable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Define the national whatever, and suddenly someone's the odd one out.
What's the irony, right? Trying to make everyone feel like they belong, you end up excluding people to do it. The whole concept of a minority only makes sense in this context.
And even then, it's slippery. Like Sikhs in India. Minority in the whole country, but in Punjab.
They're the majority. Proves it's not just about numbers, right? It's about power. Who gets to decide who's the norm, who controls the government, the culture?
So there's always pushback. Even within these powerful states, people constantly figuring out their identity, pushing back against the official story.
All the time. People aren't just robots following orders. We adapt, reinterpret, find ways to make it our own.
Reminds me of that revitalization idea.
Exactly. Shows how tough cultural identity is. Like Indo-Trinidadians, they were brought over to Trinidad, their Indian heritage. People tried to stamp it out. Generations later,
It came back stronger.
way stronger. They became successful in Trinidadian society, and suddenly that heritage they were told to forget became a point of pride, a way to resist being absorbed completely.
Almost like the harder you try to erase difference, the more it matters.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Identity is not this fixed thing. It's shaped by what we go through personally, but also these bigger forces at play, always evolving.
It makes you think, doesn't it? All this like personal journeys, but playing out against this backdrop of massive societal change. And then there's that question of, like, where's the line between celebrating what makes us different and, well, identity politics, right?
Yeah.
When does focusing on who we are turn toxic?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. No easy answers, unfortunately. But one thing that helps me is, instead of getting lost in the specifics, every group's got their own story, right?
Right.
Look for the patterns underneath, what you might even call the grammar of identity politics, how it plays out regardless of the exact content.
Grammar. Like a set of rules that just gets repeated.
Kind of. One big one is harping on victimhood. Shared history of being wronged, real or, well, exaggerated.
To the point, it's like any disagreement you have isn't just on the issues, it's disrespecting their whole past.
Exactly. It's a way to shut down debate. You disagree. You obviously don't get how much we have suffered. Happens all the time. Control over how history is told. Demonizing anyone who questions our version.
So much for nuance, huh? Like history gets simplified to serve this one group's goals.
It's unavoidable, almost. And to cement that narrative often goes hand in hand with this idea of cultural purity. The past was this perfect thing, and any outside influence is like contamination.
So it's future focused too.
Yeah.
Not just righting old wrongs, but making sure everything going forward fits this one very specific view.
Exactly. Tighter immigration, controlling what's taught in schools, it all ties in. You start drawing these stark lines between us and them. That's where it gets dangerous.
Makes me think of apartheid South Africa, actually.
Yeah.
That wasn't just individual prejudice, right? The whole system was built on this messed up idea of what a nation should be.
And it shows how powerful ideas are. How we think about ethnicity, identity, it shapes reality in profound ways.
It's a lot, honestly. We've gone from factories to newspapers to, like, the very nature of what it means to belong. It's kind of overwhelming. Makes you wonder, where do we go from here? Can we even have both? Wanting to be part of something bigger and respecting that we're all different.
Right. The human need to belong, it's not going anywhere. But maybe the first step isn't solving it, but just admitting how complicated it is. Nationalism, ethnicity, this stuff is powerful, for good or evil. The more we understand where it came from, how it works, even when it's being used against us, the better chance we have of not messing it up even worse.
Not erasing our differences, but, I don't know, finding a way for them to not be the thing we tear each other apart over. Which, yeah, easier said than done, probably. But, hey, something to think about, right? Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.